the ruined city. The man was tall. His arms and hands were covered in scars and burns, old white scars crisscrossed with red new ones. He held the knife at the level of their necks, casually, as if it were a breadstick. Like the Minotaur, whispered Con. At the man's side, close at his heels, waddled an enormous vulture with a red head and a curved beak. Its head came up higher than the man's knees. That small person in the Dolores trouser suit. The man's nostrils had a high flare to them, and they twitched as he spoke. His voice was deep. His accent, Fred thought, belonged amongst good tailoring and fast motor cars. What's wrong with him? There was silence except for Max's sobs. Well, said the man. He twirled the knife in his fingers. The tip of his thumb was missing. He's crying, said Fred. Why? He sounds like a dying screech owl, like a lion blowing on a ship's whistle. Fred's heart was red hot and beating double time. He was surprised that his voice sounded almost calm. He's 5. That's not a reason. You're pointing at a knife at his head, said Leela. That's not a good reason. But he lowered the knife. The man stepped closer into a patch of green sun, and they could see him more clearly. His dress was exquisite, but it smelled pungent. His trousers, Fred saw, were quite ordinary, green khaki, worn through at the knee and spotlessly clean, but that, along with a white shirt torn off at the elbow and patched up with cotton fibre, was the only thing about him that was normal. His shoes were made from what looked like alligator skin, with very thin binds for shoelaces. A jacket, sewn neatly from black furs, hung over his shoulders. The buttons were caiman teeth. He wore leather cuffs on each wrist and a signet ring on his little finger. From a distance, he might have been on his way to a country house party. Up close, he looked as though he had reconstructed a prime minister from once living things. Con swallowed. She spoke in a whisper. Is it just me, or does he look like the kind of person who won't definitely not kill you? Her eyes were stretched open, and her skin was taut over the bonds in her face. Fred's entire body had gone rigid, spine and shoulders and knees frozen, but he managed to nod his head 1/2 centimetre. He spoke out of the corner of his mouth. It's not just you. The man took another step towards them. His right leg swung slightly out to the side as he moved. Fred noticed for the first time that his right foot was strapped with 3 slim, highly polished pieces of wood. Despite the limp and the scars and the stubble, the animal Fred thought of was a panther. Something with strong jaws and sharp manners. Who are you? Asked the man. None of the children answered. They looked at each other. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. How did you get here? Asked the man impatiently. Fred tried to take a deep breath. Our plane crashed, he said, and the pilot died, and we followed a map. He put his hands in his pockets, attempting to look nonchalant while trying to find something he could fight with if he needed to. He could feel only a handful of squashed acacia berries which would not be very deadly in a battle. Show me! Fred handed him the scrap of bark, fumbling in his back pocket, his fingers suddenly uncooperative and clumsy. The man glanced at it. Who drew this? Silently, Con raised her hand. Based on what? Con shook her head so that her hair fell in a protective wave across her face. Well, said the man. We found a map in a tree, said Fred, and Con made a copy of it when it got wet. The man screwed up the bark in his hand. Please, said Leela, don't be angry. All we wanted to do was get home. The man looked down at the vulture as if for inspiration. And what am I supposed to do with you now? Nothing. Just let us stay for a while. We won't make any noise, said Leela. That small one will. Max felt the man's gaze fall on him, and he began to cry again. The man let out a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Leila picked Max up. Sorry. Her voice wavered, and Baka caught the fear from her skin and let out a meow like a cat. He's only 5, she whispered. You all keep saying that as if it's an explanation. Should I like him simply because he's small? I do not like undercooked food. Children are just undercooked adults. Con's lip began to quiver. Fred looked at her, surprised, but he moved his shoe half an inch so that their feet touched. The man looked at them, ranged in a line in front of him, shaking with nerves and expectation. He sighed. Are you thirsty? He asked. Yes, said Fred. Very, said Leila. Very, very, said Max. He sniffed tearfully and wiped a great wedge of snot on his wrist. Wait here, he glared at Max. Don't touch the vulture. He bites when he's anxious, and it takes him very little to get anxious. Vultures have nervous souls. The man strode across a great stone courtyard. He stopped at a tree trunk, a stump of wood as wide as a well, and he lifted a slab of stone off of its top. Fred shielded his eyes and stared. The tree trunk had been hollowed out and was full of water. The man dipped a large green bowl into the water and stomped back over to them. Here! He thrust the bowl at Fred. The ring on the man's finger wasn't gold, Fred saw. It was bone, coated in flakes of iridescent snake scales. Fred looked at the bowl in his hands. It was made from an explorer's pith helmet, the brim of the hat bent into a lip. Fred sniffed it. The man raised his eyebrows. I assure you it's perfectly clean, he said. Fred took a gulp. Thankfully it didn't taste of hair, only a little of wood, birds in the rainforest. He drank deeply and then passed it to Leila, who handed it to Max, who dunked his whole head in the hat. The man waited until all 4 had drunk. Then he took back the bowl and offered it to the vulture. As the vulture drank, the man rested his hand on the bird's head and stroked its wattle with his thumb. His face was tense. What is it that you want? He said. The children looked at each other. We want you to help us get home, said Leila. She spoke very quietly, so quietly he had to bend down to hear. And why should I? I can't look after Max much longer. He has allergies and nightmares, and I don't know what I can dress him with if he keeps ripping holes in his clothes. Please help us. As she spoke, the vulture waddled away from the man's side and headed straight for Max, who was hiccuping and sniffing. A line of snot dripped from his nose all the way down to his ankle. The vulture dipped its beak to Max's feet and pecked at the snot. Then it wedged its nose into the side of Max's shoe and breathed in deeply through the holes in its beak. What's he doing? Said Max. His eyes were dilated with fear, wide and round as pennies, but he reached down and touched the bald head of the vulture. It snapped its beak. Max snatched his hand back then, more confidently, returned it to the vulture's head. It let out a guttural croak, which sounded almost like purring. Then Max looked up, smiling at the man. He's mine now, he said. The man looked from Max to the vulture, and back at Fred and Leila and Con. His face was emotionless, but his eyes were not. I shouldn't trust the instincts of that bird, he said. He probably just thinks the boy smells like meat. But, all right, come with me.